If you're a new player to tabletop role-playing games or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, there's a really good chance that you might be overwhelmed by the amount of information you have to keep track of. Even when it comes to creating a character, there are a lot of little choices that you make that end up having bigger consequences. My name is John from Incendium D&D, and welcome to D&D Cram School. In this video series, we're going to be going over all of the major steps of character creation so that they're easy to understand. That way, in the future, if you go to create a character, you can do so quickly and completely and be confident that you didn't miss anything. For this first video, we're just going to be doing a quick overview over the 5 main steps of character creation. And in later videos, we'll go a little bit more in depth to what each of those steps means. So let's dive in. Our 5 major steps are going to be to select our character's race, class, background, generate and allocate their ability scores, and then finally pick our starting equipment. We're actually going to start in the middle of this by explaining ability scores, since these 6 numbers are going to underlie all of the math that we deal with at the table. Each creature in 5th edition D&D, whether it's a player character or a shopkeeper or a monster that you're fighting, has 6 ability scores that kind of sum up their strengths and weaknesses. And these 6 scores are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And when you design your D&D character, it's important to note that the gameplay is based around math and probability. When allocating these scores, you're basically deciding what kind of roles you want to be more or less successful in. And having played D&D for a pretty long time now, I can say that this specific system rewards specialization over versatility, meaning that your character is probably going to want to prioritize 1 or 2 of these ability scores rather than being mediocre at all 6 of them. This is my quick hot take here, but a lot of players will go out of their way to make suboptimal choices for narrative reasons. But just remember, the result you roll is determining what story is being told. Meaning, if you create a race, class, background combination and you don't optimize those ability scores, it just means your character is going to fail more often. You can definitely go against the grain with these decisions, but just know that's really the decision you're making, is that you're minimizing your chances to succeed. That can be really fun for a lot of players, but for some players that may not understand that element of the game, it can be really frustrating. So it's at least good to acknowledge the narrative impact of the game's underlying math. And the reason I wanted to start with the 6 ability scores is that when we talk about your character's race, class, and background, that term is going to come up pretty often. So next up, we're going to talk about our character's race. And our character's selection of race is really going to determine their biology and culture. In terms of your character's gameplay, your selection of race is going to determine their size category, speed, languages, and vision. Each race also has unique traits that sum up that race's culture. For example, dwarves have a stone cunning trait, which allows them to be better at history checks that identify works made of stone, to reflect that dwarven cultural value of stone making. And wood elves have specific weapons training, which show that they have a specific cultural attachment to those weapon types. You might also notice that in the player's handbook, that each race also tends to have a locked ability score increase. So going back to dwarves have a constitution bonus of +2, whereas elves have a dexterity bonus of +2. Now, in the recent book, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, there was introduced this variant rule where you can swap those ability score increases around. So basically, traditionally, there would be some races that would mesh better with some classes because of the way the ability scores lined up. But now it's easier than ever to combine any race-class combo to make a unique character. One last thing before moving on is that each race usually has a little lore blurb in its entry, and I would avoid assuming that this is the lore that your DM wants to play by unless they confirm it with you directly. Each table may play in a unique D&D world, whether it's a published setting like Faerun or Eberron, or something customly created by your DM. So basically, during character creation, you want to have an open conversation with your DM about the specific culture that their world plays by. And even in official settings, the cultures of certain races are portrayed differently. For example, if you read Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, which is really about Faerun, then they'll say that halflings are mostly peaceful farm folk that don't really adventure unless they need to. Whereas in Eberron, halflings are dinosaur riders and gangsters. Two very different portrayals with the same rule set. And maybe your DM has something completely different, where halflings in their world are mostly a seafaring folk. Or maybe halflings live in volcanoes or something. You really just want to kind of check in to make sure neither of you are making mistaken assumptions. Anyway, on to the next part of our character is going to be our character's class. In a lot of ways, this is the most important decision you're making for your character. When your character levels up, your class is going to determine most of their new powers and features. And it determines things like if your character prefers to fight with weapons or spellcasting, if out of combat, if they're more of a wilderness survival expert or some kind of cunning diplomat. Each class has unique rules, gameplay, strategy, and stories to tell. And the other thing to acknowledge about 5th edition in particular is that the class designs have a lot of thematic overlap. For example, if you're thinking of a character that wants to be a master archer, then there are actually a few different options that can satisfy that concept. You could build a fighter that takes the archery fighting style. You could take a rogue that sneaks around and gets a lot of damage on a single ranged attack. Or you could build a ranger that has access to certain spells that make their arrows more powerful. All of those characters can be master archers in concept, but how they feel and play at the table are going to be unique. And because of that, the stories that are going to be told at the table are going to be unique as well. Your character's class is really going to determine whether your character prefers to fight with weapons or spells, what equipment they're going to be proficient in, their saving throw proficiency, so if they're going to be better at warding off physical attacks or mental attacks. And each class is going to have features that specifically call out 1 or 2 ability scores that they specialize in. And this is why we talked about ability scores first. Because if you play something like a wizard, that character's magic is going to be based off of their intelligence modifier. So if you're thinking about playing a wizard character and you want them to be competent, you're going to want intelligence to at least be one of your higher scores. Whereas if you're playing a sorcerer, their magic is based off charisma. So you're going to want charisma instead to be a higher score than intelligence. Next up as a choice is our character's background. Mechanically, your background really gives you 2 of any skill proficiencies, 2 in any combination of tool, language, or vehicle proficiencies, and a custom feature that kind of ties you into the game world. Now, background is also often the mechanical representation of your character's backstory, which isn't a mechanical thing, that is a narrative thing. And remember that your background is who your character was, not who they are. Personally, there's a lot of times I really like to play with this idea, where maybe you have a wizard character that has a soldier background that found that fighting was really messy on the front lines, so maybe they learned magic as a way to be a little more elegant with how they go through the world. Your backstory is something that's more narrative and a lot less mechanical, and it can be as complex or as simple as you desire. A strong DM will also likely weave elements of your character's backstory into the larger story that plays out at the table. Sometimes exploring a single character's backstory might even be a complete narrative arc that your table explores. And the one thing I really want to highlight here is that your background mechanics should reflect your character's backstory. And you can have a lot of fun, unique combinations. So for example, let's say your character is a paladin, but formerly in their life, they might have been a thief or an urchin. This gives them a unique perspective that other paladin characters in the world may lack. Consulting with your DM, background can also be a very custom personal thing. A lot of players get confused because there are a lot of examples of background in the player's handbook. And if you read the rules on page 125, you'll actually find that a lot of these are examples and you're not meant to be locked into only these choices for background. So I encourage you, talk to your DM, create something custom, and really dig into the narrative of the DM's world. The last choice we're going to make has to do with equipment. Now, you may notice when you're selecting your character's class that there is a section in each entry for starting equipment. And a lot of times you're making very simple A, B, or ABC choices. If you're a new player, probably the most impactful choices you're going to be making are based off of your weapons and armor. Your choice of armor class is going to determine how often your character gets hit. And your choice of weapon is really going to determine how much damage you do. But it's good to note that different weapons sometimes have special properties. So for example, if you're playing a fighter character, you may want to pick up the polearm master feat, which will mesh better with some of the polearms that are described in that feat. And that way you can have this character with like a 10-foot reach where they're not really letting other enemies get close to them. Or if you're playing a dexterity character, you may not want to have heavy armor because it's going to make it harder to sneak around. Those are the 5 big steps to character creation. Stay tuned in this series as we dive deeper into each of these choices and what it means for your character's creation. And if you like this video, just remember to like and subscribe to get more easy tips to starting your adventure. Have an awesome day, everybody!